Welcome to the Easton Book Festival. I'm Chris Phillips. I'm one of the vice presidents on the board, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this exciting program featuring Marley Youmans and several people reading and commenting on her work. I'd like to start off thanking our sponsors, particularly the Book and Puppet Company, the GEDP, WDIY, the Lafayette College Humanities Center as our prime sponsors. Thank you so much for your support in bringing this programming to our local community and beyond. I'm now going to turn things over to John Wilson, longtime editor and book critic, who will introduce Marley and her work to us before we hear several excerpts from her fiction and poetry read.
It's a privilege to be part of this program. Marley Youmans is a national treasure, and what we're going to do is not talk about her, but offer an invitation to enter in briefly but deeply to her imaginative world. The format is very simple. We're going to have readings from 7 of her books, starting with her early novel, Catherwood, which is one of my favorites, and concluding with her most recent novel, Charis in the World of Wonders, which is absolutely splendid, came out this spring. And we're also going to have, among those 7 books, are some of her books of poetry. And then the program will conclude with Marley herself reading a new poem, not yet collected. Quite recently, I read a remarkable column by Richard Brookhiser, who you may know primarily as the author of a number of biographies of figures in the American founding and the early republic. He writes about a lot of things, but this was a column about reading, and he was particularly concerned with contrasting reading in the pre-digital era with reading today. But there was one bit of it that really struck me. He said, reading is always listening, and then there was a comma, to a voice. And I thought, first of all, it was interesting that he put that comma there. So he made it in 2 parts. Reading is always listening, which is not the way that we most typically think of reading, but I think it's true. If we're reading attentively, it is a form of listening. And then it's listening to a voice, and there's so much built in to the notion of a voice. A voice is always personal. There are lots of things that we can listen to, but a voice is always personal. And what we're doing in this session is enabling people, wherever they happen to be, whether here where I live in Wheaton, Illinois, or in Australia or Iran or wherever else they might be, maybe in Pennsylvania, to listen to a voice, the voice of Marley Youmans as rendered through the voices of others. And I think we don't do enough of that. I think a lot of our book talk today suffers from attention to all kinds of other things, whether it's the writer's biography or their supposed ideas, or not that all those are totally irrelevant, but they're not the most important thing at all. And so this is an exercise in listening. I just have one other thing I want to say before we start, and that is I want to put in a plug for a book called Suppose a Sentence by Brian Dillon that is one of my favorite books of this year. And I thought of it as we've been talking about putting this program, introducing Marley's works together, because in this book, Brian Dillon takes 27 sentences by 27 different writers. And then in each case, he writes a short essay, a kind of exposition of that sentence that leads him in all kinds of different directions. And this is a perfect example of the kind of listening that Richard Brookhiser was talking about, listening to a voice, listening to the voice of a sentence. And so we're going to listen to Marley Youmans. Thank you.
Lost. Torque-like, fear encircled her throat with its dull, constant pressure. On their 7th day in the forest, Catherwood could no longer believe that Gabriel would find them or that she would discover herself on the doorstep of home. For 6 days she had wandered in circles, trying to cross the path. Once she had dreamed someone fired a fowling piece in the woods, but she had waked to nothing but the whistles of birds. Once she closed her eyes and said, "We will be back at the Greville house with Jamie chasing a painted ball and Lacey reading aloud to Mother, and we will be there too, picking bloody warriors to weave a crown." Elizabeth's fingers fluttered on her eyelids. "Ma," she said, "way up." When Kath opened her eyes, there was Elizabeth and the big wilderness of America. A Maze, Elizabeth. Certain only that she was west of Albany, she began to walk northeast toward the river. She would meet a trapper or a party from Fort Orange or a band of the river Indians, the Mohicans. The fear was always there, hands around her neck, for Elizabeth needed clean clothes, cooked food, a warm bed at night. On the 7th morning, Catherwood's milk took minutes to let down, and she worried that they were moving too quickly. She decided they would walk only from dawn until noon. The rest of the day, she could wash soiled linen, collect wood, and nurse last night's carefully preserved coals into a new fire, prepare food, and weave a shelter of hurdles. Sarah's gift of clay pot had been a lucky providence, and Kath could not think how else she could have carried coals from camp to camp. Flints were frustrating, hard to use. So far, they were not starved, although Kath always felt hungry. Thank God for Mother Child, she thought. She had loved going to visit the old woman, poking about her house, learning about plants. The cottage seemed no more than a thatched nest, the outer walls and roof greening with moss, so that even the very quarrels in the one window by the door were layered with the thinnest green. Mother Child reminded Kath of a hedgehog with her gnarled and humped back, her bristly mustache, her prickly wool cloak starred with burrs and seeds, and bits of withered flowers stuck in the shock of straw-like hair, part hanging down her back, part stacked loosely on top of her head. The principal beauty of her youth lingered, bold eyes like blue stones, looking out of a labyrinth of wrinkles. Fearless, curious, Kath trailed Mother Child as she scurried, rooting through sacks and bowls for medicines. For Margaret's brother, who gasped and choked and could not catch his breath, there was a parcel of thorn-apple leaves to be steeped in wine with sage and strawberry leaves. Periwinkle for Gaffer Withercomb's toothache. Balm and feverfew and ale for Gaffer Tap's bone shave. Then there was Mrs. Grievel's usual potion, made with wine and stored in clay bottles. Lavender water, Mother Child told the girl. Pepper for the blood flow, dried lily-of-the-valley roots and flowers, good for apoplexy, distilled in wine for 6 weeks. Between what she had learned from herb women and from others at Greville House, Kath recognized many herbs and plants, some of which she knew by name. She tasted others that looked edible, looked like cousins to the plants of home, spitting out any too bitter leaf. Plants were frightening because they came from curious toys to the baby, who wanted to explore their new shapes with her mouth, and Kath feared she might pick a poisonous leaf or flower, mushroom or berry. And Catherwood had another terror, that she might poison herself and die. Whenever the thought came to her, she pictured a different loss. A hungry and cold Elizabeth tugging at her mother's bodice, an Elizabeth pawed by bears, dragged to a lair, an Elizabeth stumbling deep into the woods, falling in a ravine. Perhaps a trapper or Indian would find the child, or perhaps the unicorns would bear her away. Catherwood had started foraging on the 3rd day, eating the flower heads and heart leaves of violets, carefully avoiding birdfoot leaves for fear of monkshood and larkspur. At first, Elizabeth had thrust out her tongue, refusing to eat the flowers, but Kath tore them to pieces, feeding her bit by bit. When they clung to her lips, Kath pushed the sodden petals back in her mouth. "This is a mighty task," she said, rubbing a cheek against the baby's tangled hair. The flowers, white and blue and purple, glimmered on a shady stream bank. How many flowers would be enough to content a baby, Kath wondered. The baby accepted the young leaves of marsh marigold and bladder companion, but the wood sorrels made her shake her head. No, 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 she called. It was the close of the season for fiddleheads, and Kath collected the silvery claws of bracken rubbing off their woolly coats. Even better were the tightly furled croziers of what the pastorals called feather fern, a brilliant green under papery scales. Violets and young ferns were already plentiful along streams and in the moist woods, and once she came on a patch of morels. Kath shaped cooking pots from the bark of paper birches, the seams patched with pine resin. The first efforts were leafy cones. With practice, she fashioned a crude bucket. After she sealed the pots, cooking was simple, when they didn't break apart or spill under the pressure of cooking. Using a makeshift shovel of bark, Kath scooped rocks from the bed of coals and tipped them into the stew of leaves, stems, and roots. It was good to give thanks, to eat, to make a bonfire, to frighten away animals and provide warmth, to weave a shelter of branches and willow withies. Still, the grasp of fear never left her throat, with her longing for Gabriel was so palpable that she believed he must feel the yearnings of her heart, concentrated on him and Elizabeth. For these two only could keep her alive, keep her digging roots in the muck or heaping up waste wood to burn, weaving a shelter in the spring rain.
Diamond. Without help, she could not have endured. She wasn't equipped for cold and night and the strangeness of what was asked. She hailed not from our cloudy forests, but from the east and the southern mountains. Born at the hairpin angle of a road, she was the only child of a mother with cabin, garden, and improbable fairy tale craft, potter, with a chamber of controlled volcanic ferocity and salt to crack her glazes. Close by was a reservoir with red banks like a wound, and often the girl drifted over its near stagnant waters with a fishing line gripped between her fingers. She felt the weight of the dammed water like overturned mountains thrusting their peaks into the earth. She waited on the flick of fish and dreamed of drowned hamlets with white shapes going to and fro in soft jade, moving through water-paned windows. That she found us was a miracle. The sequoias and the burled immensities of our firs called to her as people are sometimes summoned by a wildness utterly foreign. Our fathers and mothers, the eldest trees, 2,000 years old and more, seers of the long ago star that rocked the world. Her first dawn in the west. I imagine Diamond whirling through ferns and oxalis while clouds are still resting on the shoulders of redwoods. Already she can sense the looping glide of the flying squirrels and the slumber of a fog lark in its green egg. From the highest branch, a murrelet chick is tumbling all the way to the rock-torn sea on its maiden flight. Diamond feels every inch of the forest uncurling like the fronds of veins under her skin until she cartwheels and whoops with pleasure, a salamander clinging to her damp finger like a ring. But that first day, it wasn't spring. She stumbled onto our gathering in a mill town and came forward when the man we call Puck spoke out against the multi-faced beast, Naxon, and called for volunteers. He asked someone to stake out the giant called Thur Balali. With us, the trees have names. And she answered, though ignorant and unknown to our Sherwood foresters. She might have said her given name. If so, it was drowned out in protest, and I could tell that Diamond flew into her thoughts, when Puck hastily explained our way of naming. Probably the word meant nothing to her. Such names came to their own queer fit in time. Thur-Balali. Already I was enchanted. The stubbornness that made her continue despite knowing nothing of the merry band or even proper dress for the trees attracted my interest. Something struck me as comical but brave about this tiny person tilting at the unknown. In the West, we grow our women to be Amazons. When she tired, I almost offered to carry her. She hadn't yet learned to move lightly in the muck and wasn't muscled enough for the hike. Her face was alert, keen to see what was next, a braid thumping her back when she jogged. I've always preferred blue eyes, and there was an air of fairy tale about her. Lips as rosy as the ruby called pigeon's blood, skin as white as snow, hair as black as ebony. From the nearest road, Thur-Balali is reached by a spiraling steep way across free lands and those owned by Naxon. I know the paths so well that I walk them in my dreams. I've hiked from the pull-off to the tree 1,000 times, almost daily for the 3 years we kept a sit there, most of them poor, patched-together stays of less than a week. Not until we found Diamond, or she found us, did we have someone with nerve to endure sleet and hail and winds. On that first day, she struggled across the hillside, cheeks flushed. At base camp, she was cold, her cotton clothes soaked with sweat. When we reached the satellite, I scavenged a fleece jacket and a waterproof bag left over from a previous sit. She ran her hand over the blue blot on Thur-Balali, named by an Irishman who spent one uneasy night in its crown. And I told her that Naxon's mark meant that the tree was fated to fall. The scorch lines scarring the trunk and the man-high cave at the base, the chamber of lightning, surprised her. It'll hold, I promised. I've scaled this tree 100 times. I watched her closely, unsure whether she understood what she was in for. But her voice trembled only a little as she searched for the 3 small platforms at the top, and I admired her mastery of fear. I've never been afraid in a tree, but most people are. It's nothing I boast of. My fears lie elsewhere. The prusik knots hold your life, I cautioned, wrapping a cord around the climbing rope. I guided her into the harness, explaining how to work the climbing knot and carabiners. I enjoyed uncurling her fingers and fastening them around the line. She hardly noticed, her mind focused on the knots and on the canopy that from the forest floor seemed more like a cloudy rumor than a place. Slipping her foot into a loop, she stood straight, locking the lower prusik. Then she thrust the chest prusik as high as she could before leaning back to loosen the lower one and push it up. Standing on the loop, she lifted the upper knot. That was her only lesson, and it lasted just a few minutes. Soon she was creeping up the line while I shouted encouragement. I could see the soles of her inadequate, pathetic boots sliding on air. Soon she had passed 15, 30, 60 feet. At about 90 feet, where the tower divides, I glimpsed her clinging to the bark, resting like an animal. I have no idea whether she was overcome by fright and the distance yet to travel, or whether she was simply feeling the thick, furrowed skin of the sequoia. She was about halfway to the lowest platform. Probably it was no more than 20 minutes before the harness was lowered. When I reached the first platform, I found that she was gone, and peered over the edge to make sure that there was no body spread-eagled on the ground. She must have climbed farther with a pair of lobster claws. 2 or 3 pairs were usually lying in a corner of the platform. I was impressed that she hadn't huddled on the floor. This stage of arboreal life was dedicated to the nerves of the tree sit, with batteries, cell phones for emergencies and interviews, video camera, and laptop. Buckets of recycled plastic bags, line, and bottles were stacked in a corner. Free climbing through the branches, I reached the second stage, a combination toilet and supply room, and kept going to the third. And there she was, sitting lotus style on the highest raft of all, and talking with Koho, a guy reputed to be a grad student at Berkeley. You couldn't tell it by me. He had an astonishing head of hair, long spirals that stood straight out. Some called him the Red Dandelion. I liked him well enough, but he was unreliable, coming and going like a will-o'-the-wisp. A small stone lamp glowed in the corner, throwing its beams onto Diamond's face, making chips of light glitter in her eyes. Her whole attention was on Koho, and I hated him for it. Then she saw me and held out a hand in welcome. That night, the 3 of us slept on the upper platform, the girl in the middle. Odors of jasmine and sweat mingled in her hair, and for a long time I could not sleep, lying so close beside her. She was exhausted and slept deeply, occasionally sighing as if letting go, repelling into a lower level of sleep. But I felt tight in my skin and lay awake, watching the shadows of branches on the tarp. A shadow flew over, skating back and forth, and soon after I heard the scream of an animal. Shivering, I unzipped my bag and let my hand brush against her cheek. It was cool and damp, utterly removed. Dryad. I am the keeper of Thur Balali. If there's someone up top, immured like a princess in a tower, I am the man who scales the fortress with groceries and supplies. I bear away the bucket of filth and bury it in secret places. If the tree is attacked, a platform or harness vandalized by the woods knaves of Naxon, I am the one who free climbs to the top and repairs our losses. If someone falls, the death is mine. Some call me Robin Hood because I go where I will, and Naxon's fences are no barrier to me. My loyalty is to Thur Balali, root, stem, and cone. The tree is a temple, and I her servant. Seldom does anyone in my temple tower surprise me. We Sherwooders know the rules of our game and abide by them. Yet Diamond surprised me. The morning after her first night in the tree, I left with Koho and did not return until the next afternoon, when I brought hot food from the satellite camp and clothes I had scrounged from friends, silk long johns, a jacket, fleece pants, socks, and gloves. Nearing Thur Balali, I hooted to signal my approach. Like something obscure seen from the corner of an eye, change niggled at me. Perhaps one of the Naxon climbers was staking out a redwood. Not until a cell phone smacked my cheek did I realize what Diamond had done. Laptop, bundles of batteries, video camera, phones, and tapes dangled from Thur Balali. Each one had been carefully wrapped in layers of plastic bags and secured with twine and rope from the recycling bucket. It's a lie, she told me. It's not right to bring those things here. What about interviews? I knew what Dowser back at the Sherwood office would say. What about the radio stations, newspapers? That's part of why you're here, to tell the story of trees that Naxon wants to destroy. You can't be a Luddite and get out the news. Her feet were bare and bark had scraped her instep. She had been climbing. Thanks for the clothes. When she smiled at me, I knew. I would clip off those machines and pack them out. I just don't want everything the merry men's way. I'll roost here, maybe forever. But I'm no child to be ordered around by some shirt in an office. Dowser wouldn't like that description, I reflected. Sherwooders didn't want to be pegged as administrators when what we loved was the romance of wilderness. Several hundred feet below us, a phone was ringing. I would have some explaining to do when I answered it. You still need a hat, I said. Tomorrow I'll bring water so you can bathe. My eyes drifted to the empty plastic bucket in the corner. Conjuring nakedness, a sea sponge left behind by Coho and a chunk of soap lay beside it. Val? Sorry. I blushed for my imaginings and, leaning forward, scrutinized her face. Everything all right? Yeah, she was doing fine. I was beginning to think that she was a woods nymph. She took to climbing so easily. She was slim and pale enough for something fey, and I had always believed that these forests were the haunts of magic. That might be half a joke, but it seemed a mighty good one this afternoon. I like blue eyes, I told her. That's good, since yours are blue, aren't they? She was laughing at me. I didn't mind, not then, though my eyes aren't blue. Close, but not blue. A friend had suggested the tint to make a lost contact easier to find against wood and leaves. It didn't help much. You're not lonely? I lingered, unwilling to depart. Again, the wild idea came to me that she might be something inhuman from the eastern woodlands. Her accent was alien, the vowels impossibly languorous, as though she were speaking with a smooth river stone in her mouth. It seemed an ancient, primitive manner of making words. My glance lit on her feet and the broken skin with its smear of blood. No, she was like us, ruled by gravity and liable to harm.
Scout ceremony. Old choices made are all around. Across the way, the hanging ground. Above, the mansions on the ridge, and underfoot, the hand-laid bridge. The trees all luminous with snow, the flaming arrow on the bow. The solemn older boys who cross the crenellated bridge and fosse between the worlds, while arcs of fire make images of heart's desire. This cobbled up mythology, this arrow's blaze of purity, the animals with human speech, the four direction winds that teach the west of dark, the east of light, the compass of the soul's delight. Surprise us with a note of power that lingers past the meeting hour. The foliate head. Peering from medieval churches, dressed in leaves of ash and birches, Camperdown elm and English oak, dog hopple, sassafras, and poke. Here winks the sprite who can transcend his yearly death, for whom no end can be unless by our misdeed. His verdant woman bleeds to breed. A world of leaves, his phoenix pet, cries cockerel against regret, remorse, and all that's passed away, while crowing in triumphant day. The green man's lodge is budding wood, his roof beams resurrection rude. The axis mundi staking cloud to earth and realms below the shroud. The roulette balls fly around the sun, the spiral years are never done. Within my dreams, he's young and lithe, unheeding of the reaper's scythe. But when I meet him in the park, he's changed his guise from light to dark. I go to grasp his creaking hands and find him dressed in swaddling bands. Ship of trees. Nails tingle in boards, freezing in the grain, and the whole house struggles to conjure some swaying rootedness, rampire and bulwark against invader cold and winter's gusts. Outside, the still living limbs comb and catch. Migrant months ago, all leaf fright tumbled south to mulch, and so this naked writhing with no green hands to stem the streams of air. In the heaped bed, your hazel eyes yawn black, staring into the night at pale tossings past the window panes as the winds shiver the glass, playing it like an instrument. I lie down by your side to whisper how inside each weathered length of sawn clapboard, more than 2 centuries old that harvest, sleep rings of years, the memory of trees. Wood will remember how to stand in brunt of freeze and gash of winds, to dance, to tack like a grove of chestnuts sailing the breeze, bringing the cargo of us to shores of dawn. And when you drift away from me, I lie with eyes open to the rule of darkness, hearing the cold withdrawing of the nails, watching branches sweep the prickles of stars. Your breath is pulsing on my cheek, and I shift closer, pushing away all winter thoughts, letting each die alone in the chilly room like a stranger who lacks my harbored joy. In all her gleaming youth, she said, "Dearest mother, will you blame me because I could not stay? And will you rail so bitterly when all the world is May?" Last night I stood beside the door and looked my fill of you until the overflowing store seemed images of rue. And yet I could not leave his side as light and leaf unfurled. I am the forest promised bride. We green the springing world.
On a window ledge, Cynthia saw a book, splayed open, and picked it up. The title did not interest her, but she skimmed a starred passage marked Childhood in the margin. The green trees, when I saw them first through one of the gates, transported and ravished me. Their sweetness and unusual beauty made my heart to leap, and almost mad with ecstasy. They were such strange and wonderful things. Boys and girls tumbling in the street and playing were moving jewels. All day, magical gates, she thought. And here were children again, as if in answer to her feeling of loss. A fresh fear gave her a pang, that she had given over all chance of looking with infant sight at a world made new. And what was that but the beginning of art? Reflected in the panes, her eyes seemed sad, infiltrated by shadows. Iz was leaning in the door. "Check the flyleaf," she said, and Cynthia thumbed to the front of the book. Lydia Lanier, New Orleans. "Oh, that's our rector's wife, Lydia Wren. She's a piece of work. I like her, mind you. She's full of original vim." "Maybe you'd like to give the book back." "No, you take it to her. Then you'll know 2 people. Iz peered out the window. "Think I'll sweep the flagstones. Looks like the stream left a bunch of trash." "I haven't agreed to move," Cynthia said, but Iz was already gone. "I really haven't," she told the empty room. "And I don't know where Lydia Wren lives, or anything." Venturing into the courtyard, she found that Iz was still talking about the book's owner. "You can't miss her," she was saying. "Rectory right next to the church, near the river, a block off Main Street. Funny lady. Writes a column for the newspaper. Lydia, I mean. Maybe, Cynthia began. Besides, there's Father Hale, too. Hale Wren. Wonderful man. Cynthia glanced at the trellises with their dried relics of clematis and at the spray ricocheting off the stones in the ravine. She remembered her mother's voice, impatient and worried. Do some painting, go to church, and get a life, Cyn. But she had ignored the advice. It had taken her years to get over Colm. A few people won't have any part of the place, Iz called. Did they tell you? My precious cousins? Of course not. A few years ago, the beavers abandoned this piece of the creek and started to build higher. And afterward, their old dam broke and the water ripped through the gulch and flooded the house. The stove and fridge ended up flip-flopped on the far side of the kitchen. The watermark inside was 4 feet. They've had it all painted since. Cynthia stepped back, eyeing the watercourse. Could happen again, Iz said, her voice as bright as a gong that trembles with warning. Lucky thing nobody was in the gatehouse. I knew a fellow who was fishing at the edge of Glimmerglass. He heard a sound like thunder and spied a jumble of trees riding on the flood, slamming straight toward him. He started running for his life. Did he catch it? Cynthia pictured the man chasing a white wisp through the shallows. He got himself safe home, Iz said. In a blink of fright, Cynthia saw the churning stream dash itself against the flimsily latched doors. She tripped, and the waters plunged her to the matting and shoved murk into her mouth. It didn't matter. Hadn't she often thought of life as a surreal landscape, pitted with trap doors that could collapse at one wrong footstep? Yes, she would move here and rent the gatehouse. Like a tropical stalk erupting in a New England garden plot, whim shot up and flowered. She would be proud and careless, and not afraid of an animal hovel of sticks hurled pell-mell to the shore. Her reflected face, cross-hatched by the lead seams of a window, gleamed pale and transparent. Are there ghosts? But Iz didn't hear over the frolics of the water, and she had to ask again. Ghosts? Nothing but what you bring, I expect, Iz said, not pausing in her sweeping. Cynthia's glance settled on the trees across the stream. Who didn't have ghosts? And she was diminishing, changing, her face momentarily strange in the glass. She had hold of the tail end of middle age. She was an attractive woman, often mistaken for one much younger. Her hair still shone black, with only sparse threads of snow, and her skin was unwrinkled. There might be something left for her, here in the gatehouse beyond the village. Hadn't she long ago combed her hair with the teeth of pain, eaten the poisoned apple, and married the Prince of Fire? What more could hurt her now? Perhaps she would at last sketch and paint just for herself. Something not yet glimpsed would console her for the princes who would not do, and the children she might have borne, and the high art that had failed her. The art that she had failed. In October, the cold would seal the stream in ice. Snow would sag the limbs outside the kitchen window and turn the world stainless, as if it knew nothing of blood and dirty deeds. She would build a snow maiden in the courtyard and feed the birds that had the courage to stay and not fly south. Perhaps she could seek and find new comforters. Those little bearded men with the merry eyes, eternally glad that she had not stayed in the tower with the prince, but had at last returned home. On sunny days, she would open wide the 7 doors to let them come in.
The Soul, the Spirit, and the Meteor. The incident of the child's soul, the spirit of story, and the meteorite was said to be a tale that Connell Weaver recounted in his last year of high school, living away from Cross Plains and just about as close to happy as he would ever be. The recollections of friends agree that Connell had been telling stories all one afternoon. The boys had been lying on the floor at full length, glad for the coolness of the boards on a hot day, while they drew a battle scene with pencils on a long smudged roll of paper. They were drinking sugared mint water, one of them occasionally pressing a glass with its cool gathered drops against the forehead or an arm. Somebody asked for a story about pirates, and Connell dreamed up a fresh installment in the adventures of Longslake, who plied his trade in a scribbled path from Singapore to the Ivory Coast. The tale of Longslake and the horse pirates involved much scurrying up of ropes, a lot of dashing about decks with swords, and the attempted rescue of an unexpectedly feisty damsel. The Texas plains being entirely too hot and dry for pirates, the boys relished the story and called out encouragement to Longslake in his watery troubles. Afterward, Connell rolled onto his back and, staring at the plaster ceiling, told a little tale that ended only when Mavie came in, fagged with heat, the handkerchief that they all knew to be spotted with blood, balled in a fist. Unlike most of his stories told to please friends, this one featured himself. Perhaps that is why the boys, then young men with jobs and wives or sweethearts, recalled it in later days after Connell had departed the world so decisively. Evidently, it was a mark of their respect for his storytelling that the boys wanted to know whether the tale was true. While they put final touches on the drawing and tossed pencils into a box, and then admired and rolled up the battle scene of warriors with axes and dragon-decked shields and enemy heads freed by the sword, they argued about whether such things were possible. And in the end, they leaned towards a yes. For some people. For Connell. Perhaps such easy trust in what seems impossible was only the sign of an age more ready and able to run and find the very roots of story, eager to hear revelations of a Grendel or a fairy queen, or of the fair trees along a shining river, each one with leaves for the healing of the nations. Whatever the reason, the boys thought about Connell's words long enough to recall the day and the tale more than a decade later. The story went something like this. Once a meteor tunneled through the atmosphere and thumped into the earth, and as it fell, the boy Connell tumbled like Lucifer out of safety and lit rooms and into the deep night outside the house, where there were no streetlights and nothing but dark and more dark, like the infinite night folded and tucked inside a magician's top hat. The soul of the child was knocked clean from his body and flew like a bird into a soapberry tree and perched, shuddering at the shock and at the strangeness of seeing its own husk lying in the grass and weeds. Then, with a flick of the wings, the soul shot towards the streak of light. The bright flash was the mark left by the meteor. This stone traveler had passed a long way through nurseries of stars and precincts of space that were as empty and metaphysically maze-like as a desert. With hard knocks, it may have collected crystalline wisdom along the way, or perhaps the meteor was never anything but blank mineral sleep without dreams. The bird-like curl of soul lit on the shoulder of a spirit who rode that bucking Mustang meteor from the outback of space to the solid ground of Texas. And there, on a pinhead of time, all the angels could have danced and told the epic tale of creation. Because much happened to Connell in that jot of time. The spirit, for she was the spirit of all story and all storytelling, laughed with pleasure and said to the soul of the boy, "Connell, little Connell Weaver, weave me a tale." But the soul trembled and never said a word as the spirit of story flickered from one form to another, transforming from crouching meteor to mighty athlete with upended, burning clouds of hair to girl made of thready light. The spirit, who seemed composed of flame and energy, laughed at the soul's silence. His shoulders, for just then the spirit of story was he, erupted into wings of fire that bathed the soul in light but did not burn its quiet, milky substance. The figure shifted his fire feet and jigged on the hot surface of the meteorite. Did I tease you, little Connell? Well, I'm not sorry because I am never sorry. Though I will give you a gift all the same. I will make you a maker, and you may be powerful, if you will, the spirit of story promised. You will weave, Connell Weaver. You will travel until borders are nothing to you, and your brogans and dancing boots are worn to pieces. You will be a hero, a conqueror, a defeated warrior, a boxer, a defender of faith, a king struggling against a tidal crash of barbarians from over the sea. The child's soul answered in a voice like petals made of gold that clash lightly when tossed by the breeze. Who knows what the soul said? Yet perhaps the spirit of story knew, for he went on as if in reply. You will know people of many kinds, many countries. You will even travel to worlds that do not exist, or once existed, or do not yet exist, though such forays are a tricky thing for flesh and blood. The soul of small Connell Weaver sighed with a drawn-out, burnish sound, as if the gold petals were pinched between thumb and forefinger and then rubbed slowly together. Yes, the spirit of story cried, you will go to those worlds, and you will know that this world is purely imaginary, a maze without a center, and that all the things that you see are, likewise, imaginary. You will know that even your blood ties are illusory and passing, for everything inside a story, and know this most of all, that the world is a story and began with a word, is made up. And so the tale of a green knight with his chopped off head, still holding a knight of the round table to promises made, is no less true than the tale of a man crammed with secrets who spontaneously combusts and leaves behind only a black tallowy mark on the floorboards. And his story, in turn, is no less true than the tale of a Texas sharecropper's wife who's had a miscarriage only 10 days before, but just this morning was walking behind the mule and guiding the jerking plow. The soul moved to and fro on the bright figure's shoulder and nudged against her slender neck, seeking a place out of the rush of air. Because, the spirit of story said, this world is only a skip and a blink away from a more real one that you may find, or not, depending on how you walk and where. This idea seemed to excite her so that her hair grew long and blood-colored and was swept into a glory by the breeze as the meteor plunged. Still, all this was carved into one moment and monument of time, just as many tiny Indian elephants are carved and hidden in a small red bean, as if they were seeds. Given the right soil and story, that bean could be the magic to grow a world of elephants. Nothing is as it seems to be, she called out as the soul crept in the form of a milky bird along her arm. Nothing. Always there is another story and another tucked behind the arras of the world. For a moment, the spirit of story shifted to become a muscular man again, before transforming into a woman who had something of Mavy's bent, hurt posture. She snatched up the soul and cupped it in her palm. I am a teller and will make you a story, Connell Weaver, she said in a voice that crackled with laughter. I will make your life into a story to be remembered. And when you are dead and flown, you will not fathom if you have made your own tale or whether you are simply mine and all your days told by me. Though perhaps neither of these things will be true and the secret is something else entirely. The soul stirred in the nest of the spirit of story's hand. The curled fingers were no shelter from the burning thorn fire of the voice and the fury of the winds that fell so fast, so far, as with a slap, The child's soul was shoved back into the body, and Connell lay on the ground, his eyes wide to the stars, and his ears open to the cries of men running through the dark. He didn't breathe. He was like an empty bottle tossed into the weeds. Then he woke to the largeness of the sky and the flung expanse of the stars. Breath choked him into life. He drank at the air, dragging it into his lungs. His fingers trembled and pushed against a skein of mosquito netting around his head and torso. His uncle's face materialized between the boy and the stars, and a voice was asking. Connell couldn't answer. He was packed with words, but couldn't speak. And so his uncle thrust him through the window and into the bed and the bald light of the bedroom. Connell lay on the sway-backed bed, staring at the bare bulb hanging at the end of a cloth-bound wire. A cheap pull chain of tiny metal beads hung down, and a dull yellow tape, peppered with flies, flapped once and hung still. Outside, the men went on running and shouting, and once he heard a woman scream. He was too small to lie there thinking that the world was imaginary or that a truer world might lie behind this one. Instead, Connell remembered the stars sparkling on the sticky black tape of the sky and stared for a long time at the flies dangling from the ceiling. His eyes moved slowly away from their strange, dead constellations and rested on the cracks that somehow resembled the big, hand-drawn map of Mavy's family tree that she had unrolled to show him before they left home. Someone long before had marked the faded crowns of kings and queens on leaves distant from his own new leaf, added in lately by his mother with vermilion ink, a leaf unlike all the others. Connell stared up until the cracks were no longer a tree, but a map, showing a snarled, complicated river with many streams leading towards uncharted lands. After a while, he closed his eyes, though he could still see the glow from the bulb through his eyelids. It smoldered like a red star, until he sighed and let go of all that had happened and dropped like a stone into night and sleep. He thought only of a red sun lighting the river, a tangled maze that led Connell on and on into the world of dreams.
The fool takes refuge in the trees. Tucked in leaves, the fool is mineral still in a glare and bristle of spurs on spears. A holly cracked its bed of stone, scattered spiny leafage on the grass and winter stalks. His day? Brambles and stalks for the forest fool. He walks across the slopes of broom grass, where barbarians are dug in deep, their upward glare fierce as mica glinting as felsic stone. Their buried spurs fool the air, erupt as glossy holly spurs, and fine cockades of horsehair now are stalks of broom. No naming stone will cry their graves, and only the pure fool would bother mourning them, or glare at sky, ask why men and women are but grass. And yet the grass is lovely, next to bramble sprigs and spurs of holly, with a burnished glare on leaves and stalks, so that the fool forgets his heart is but a stone, and that these same barbarians, alive, would stone him dead and laugh. The grass is waving, and the fool begins to sing, and song then spurs his feet to wandering the wood. Like a crow, he stalks the forest floor, cocking his head to glare at sky. A sunny glare echoes, answers. He frames his bed with stone as if it were a grave. He heaps up stalks, winter greens, and spindly forest grass to make a mound, flicks leaves with spurs away. Dry and light, they spring like insects. The fool lies down on stalks. The hollies glare as the fool burrows in duff. He sleeps, dug deep like stone. Dream spurs him on. He drinks the air and knows that he is grass. The Two Kings. On sleepless nights, the Red King scouts the plain where lions den. The king of lions pads under stars, moving dreamily at first on his big mitts that look so clumsy thick, and then slow running, muscular sliding forward as if oiled, and leaping to arms, his wakened mane frisking out like glory, head nudging, rubbing at the Red King's face. The two are swaying, leaning forward, weight thrown each on the other, each carrying his brother, and it seems they might, like saints, ascend in the radiance of the night that rocks them in its guilt, caresses them, as if remembering when they were cubs wrestling on royal grass, transforming each with moonshine silver, till they're more than kings. Two magi, clashing with green joy against what is forever and ever other. Naked on the sands. Their silken dresses hoisted, the ladies skimmed barefoot over sand, while gentlemen tight with dignity plunked down on rumps to tug off pointy shoes and peel off hose, and potboys flashed about with trays of cups that overbrimmed with smoky bonfire tea. Perhaps the girl was startled by the crowd. Cornered in rocks, she leaped like fountain spray, naked, slashing air with a bird-like cry. All masks were flung to earth. The Red King stared. The fool stared. So transformed, their faces proved the world was cocked, slanticular, and strange. She shone distinct from all the Red King's court, not just in nakedness, but in her dream of mortal flesh, light flittering on snow. Who seized the pelt and sailed it to the flames? Some said it was the royal seneschal, some a potboy or a passing tinker. The upshot was not as the legends tell. She held her hand toward the king or fool, and then unwound, dissolved like wind-teased clouds, a skein of glitter drifting on the air. At once the Red King kneeled on the wet sand to treasure up the glinting flecks of her, but waves crept forward, stole away his pains, and nothing but a biding ache remained, for Selkies have no souls to save. I, fool, unpacked the book of the Red King and wrote these words, because I could not bear for every spark and speck of mystery to die, then sealed them with my foolish kiss. The Red Book of the King. And why is this the book of the Red King when it was plainly written by a fool? Its every word proclaims its lunar source, yet somehow this is not the fool's own book. The gardens, towers, streets, and lands beyond belong to the Red King. He is the king, and therefore the book, by rights, belongs to him. The fool has done nothing to earn the book. The fool was given a gift, and that is all. The fool deserves this much, not to be beaten, because the fool has used his precious gift. He has used it, and only you can see whether for good or ill, or maybe you don't even know, or maybe you do not have the slant of mind that can say whether it is good or whether it is ill. But the fool has made the red book, for the love of the Red King, has taken and put on the handsome cap that the Red King gave him as a birthday present, and has lifted the feather in his hand to ink the words with the very blood of his veins. So much, and that is all. That is all. That is all. And now we will close out our program with Marley Youmans reading one of her new poems to us.
Death of a Singer. This one has an epigraph from Jenny Cooper. It was a YouTube comment about singing in Eric Whitaker's virtual choir. So glad to be a part of this before I got cancer. I may not be able to sing now, but at least I can look back at this and be proud. The late Jenny Cooper. Death of a Singer. One thread among the thousands, radiance lost and found inside a flaring song. And though you are the ashes in the wind that sting against a cheek and bring on tears, your voice persists in whirling round the world, as if it sang in now instead of when. Time knelled your every instant, yet it blunts our sense of barbarous grief and devilish wrong. You're there, but inaccessible. Some ask who sinned, our singer or her kin, who whipped up fears and dread. What godly need or yearning hurled you forth? How did becoming turn to Ben? All questions sink away. The listener hunts for hints of you alive inside the song. Although the myriad of voices blend the living with the dead, eternity with years. Such mystery to hear your voice unfurled and soaring from the far off realm of then. You've paid, ah, my sweet Christ, our mortal price. We hear you singing, fly to paradise.
Thank you so much, Marley. And thanks to Keisuke and Mako and Lauren for reading. And thank you to all you viewers for joining us for this program. If you'd like to see more events like this, visit eastonbookfestival.com to take a look at our full range of programs. And be well, everyone.